I'm so used to my setup where I've got the 3, 2, 1 go that you guys watching get to watch a good couple of seconds of me just staring at the mic waiting for it to go live. Y'all, it is another Friday, which means it is time to explore the weird and mysterious. That must mean it is time once again for Friday Night Frights. I am one of your hosts. I am Joe, and of course, I am joined as always by the only man that I would want with me as we explore religious weirdness. Remember, as we get into this, you all asked for this. All right, y'all. Christian, what's up, dude?
All right, Joe. Just got back into town. You get a week off from school to hang out with family, hang out with my niece as she and her dad came down. So I'm feeling pretty good right now. Just tired from the ride.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those things about taking long car rides. I like a good road trip, but you feel drained a little bit by the time the whole thing's said and done.
I think it won't take too long for this discussion to get us both on track here as far as energy.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you all know, we are in a rotation as we go through the different topics of within Friday Night Frights. And one of the topics that we cover is religious weirdness. And for those of you that don't know, this was decided upon by the lovely members of the Priest to the Geeks group on Facebook. If you would like the if you would like access and opportunity to be able to have a say on what happens in the future on the show, if you go over to Facebook, if you look up, first off, look up Systematic Ecology and give the page a like and a follow. And then while you're at it, look up Priest to the Geeks and join the group there. So we threw this up, lots of options, and y'all decided to pick one of the most enigmatic figures in, I would argue, in history, especially when you get into mysticism and weirdness. Aleister Crowley, a man that is one of the most infamous spiritual figures of, I would say, even the modern age. And we, of course, like to bring a specific spin to this. I'm a pastor, Christian's in seminary. He's, being steeped in good old fashioned good boy theology. And um and we bring a certain flavor and a certain spin. But my life didn't just begin when I said yes to Jesus. I have a whole other part of my life, which I have shared bits and pieces of along the way. Tune into some of the past episodes to hear some of my ridiculous stories of what feels like many lifetimes ago at this point. And I've mentioned before, but I used to be an occult practitioner. Um, the thing about the occult that we kind of need to frame before we get into our subject matter here is you're going to hear that phrase occult used a lot throughout the episode and different aspects of that practice. It's kind of like a big old umbrella to say occult. For those of you watching that are of the Christian persuasion, think of the word pagan. I'm not going to make a whole lot of friends in certain groups right when talking about this. The fact that I compared those two words, but it's kind of a broad statement for a wide range of different practices. Many of them have borne modern versions of practices that are kind of a grab bag of different practices. So, things like Wicca. Wicca is kind of a collage of different belief systems. and it's not that old. Satanism, kind of a collage of different belief systems, not that old, and so on and so forth. There are other examples, but you get my point. Keep all of that in mind as we start to unpack this enigmatic figure, Aleister Crowley, and start to really think through um some of the things that we're going to talk about. But known by many names, occultist, mystic, magician, and even the wickedest man in the world, he's left behind a legacy shrouded in mystery, controversy, and spiritual experimentation. Today, we're going to be exploring the real side of Aleister Crowley, the religious philosophy that he introduced, because for better and for worse, he did put forward a true to heart religious philosophy rather than an out and out religion in the purest sense of the phrase. And really why he's a figure that feels like the echoes of his influence are still felt throughout history, even though the man has been done, dead and gone for a hot minute now. So,
Yes.
Christian, do you have any experience with who Aleister Crowley is? Did you know a lot about him before diving into today's episode?
Yeah, I'd researched him a couple times before. My initial introduction, and for the sake of this, I'm going to be saying Crowley. Uh, both pronunciations are correct as far as I know. I'm not trying to be pedantic when I say Crowley instead of Crowley. I'm not trying to be that guy. It's just how I'm more familiar with using the name. But on, ironically, being pronounced Crowley in Supernatural was kind of how I wasn't introduced to him, but as a concept of like he is named after, this enigmatic figure, the Crowley in Supernatural, the demon lord there. And then I've done research on him before. Just out of curiosity, is like, okay, everyone talks about this guy. What's he about? Like, oh, okay, this is what he's about. Well, no wonder I never would have liked him to begin with. Yeah, cards on the table. I don't think either of us are going to have a very favorable view of the man. Not to say that there's
No.
nothing we can't glean from learning from his life, but there's a list of people. If world leaders and political leaders were off the table as far as who I could go back in time and just erase from the time stream, he's on there. But I think it's still Helena Blavatsky who would be my number one kill. But he's not that far behind her.
Yeah. So I think for me, and this is going to be a seasoning, because I made a joke before we went on the air that I needed to pull an hour's worth of showtime out of, yo, this dude was a whack job who did a lot of drugs and got very famous because of rock and roll. Is really a big part of the legacy of Aleister Crowley. And yes, for anybody who is wondering, me being a musician, me being a rocker, me being a historian of music and things like that, yes, I was raised with the name Crowley because of Ozzy Osbourne. That song was my first introduction into who he was. But I think one of the um, the most compelling pieces of that we can pull out from a guy like Aleister Crowley is really broadening our awareness of religious weirdness, and like this whole section of religion that, as Christians, I think sometimes we just kind of try to run the opposite direction from, and not in like a way of, oh, I don't want to fall for that, but like in a way of almost like plugging your ears and pretending like it doesn't exist, and just totally disregarding anybody who engages in that practice and treating them like they are subhuman because of what they practice and things like that. And I think
Yeah.
there's so many, and honestly, I think some of that is part of, jokes aside, part of why Crowley is so
Mm.
famous and why he is this figure that is that sits in this weird place in history almost in the same kind of breath as Manson. I would put, if I had to pick one person from history that I would really put kind of side by side, I think, and I'm not. This isn't me giving him any sort of flowers by any stretch of the imagination, but just looking at what both men were able to accomplish, I think Manson was light years more charismatic than Crowley was. He had his followers, but
Yes.
it's the mysticism and the magic and the lore behind him that is really what gives him his staying power, where Manson was um this figure for a lot of people that people were just like magnetized to and just like completely and totally drawn to because he understood psychology, and it was at a time where psychedelics were being used for basically brainwashing. So you have this guy Crowley grows up in the late 1800s, 1875, in England is when he's born, and he's raised in a deeply religious home. Now, um it's no real big surprise. Like I'm gonna, as one of my dear Scottish friends loves to say, I'm gonna spend an hour taking the mick out of this guy. Like there's not a lot in the way of building blocks that are gonna be left by the time I'm done with this dude. Um so he's born in a deeply religious home and completely and totally rebels against everything. Now, when we're talking about deeply religious, y'all, we're talking about fundamentalism. We're talking literalism. I do not remember right off the top of my
Correct.
head what the sect is that his family was, but like to give you an idea, there was a lot of family money and his dad didn't want to touch any of it because it was made in alcohol, I think it was, and all of that is a sin.
Sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, have your standards, but watch out for your family too.
Yeah, yeah. And so, strict fundamentalist Christian group. The the Plymouth Brethren was the sect. And his early life was shaped by moralism, which is exactly what he would come to reject. And he actually went and because when he was young, his dad died, and his mom was like uh by today's standards, many believe that she would be found to be mentally ill,
Mhm.
and by today's standards, a lot of people would think that Crowley would be deemed as mentally ill as well. But he went to go live with his uncle, and his uncle was kind of like his gateway into this whole world of hedonism and do as you will, and there are no rules, and all of those kinds of things. To the point where like he's in his teens, and his uncle is like buying him prostitutes and taking him to the bar so that way he can drink, and all of this sort of stuff that is basically like the sum total of life experience. And this is really what Crowley would pull forward in his teachings as he got older, is that the sum total of the good of life, like the greatest good that you can achieve in this life, is living out your own will and doing what your own desire dictated. And so he came back to his mom afterwards, and it was actually his mom that gave him the starting point for the whole him being the beast of revelation thing and all of that sort of jazz, because she saw what he had become. And there's even a story that he um engaged with one of the maids on his mom's bed, and she found out, and the maid gets fired, gets forced into prostitution. No, this isn't going to be a family friendly episode. um, and and the old folklore is that Crowley would suggest that the maid was the first victim of Jack the Ripper, and that Jack the Ripper was a follower of the occult and like part of Crowley's grouping and things like that. So this dude, like, way off the rails from a very young age.
Yeah, and initially, I'm also kind of on his side. Now, I say initially, and I mean initial at the very beginning here. It's like living in a home like that. Well, of course, you're going to rebel. It's exactly what breeds stuff like this. You either breed someone who becomes a fanatic the same way you are, or you breed someone who's hyper against you, and neither produces truth. So I get it. I don't agree, but I get how he ended up as he did, with which you mishandle scripture this way when you uh, cause people to believe in a false idea of what the Bible says about God and about your life and what morality is. So of course he twists it into what he goes into, and it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and it's taking myself out of it and into like a modern context for a second. I look at stories like this, and this is the kind of thing that breaks my heart, because there are so many different flavors of
Hmm.
Wild and Out. Take your pick. Take your pick. The Baskin Robbins is open. There's 52 flavors of nonsense on sale for anyone to dig into. But many of them, you can trace it back to, oh, you've got some interpretation of God that looks like more like a man than like God, or has all of these different pieces chiseled out to make more sense to you. And while these are the points where I get labeled a classical theist, or I get labeled as being theologically conservative, which I think is hilarious because half the people that I talk to think I'm off in left field someplace and shot out with my theology, and the other half of the people think that I'm like, eh, I won't say what I was going to say. Anyway, um, but you can so often trace it back to a wounding, this kind of wounding. You know what I mean? And that's where he starts to develop some of like this mindset that obviously the volume gets turned all the way up on, but all the while he's traveling. He's going to Egypt, he's going to India, he's traveling to all of these different places, and he's looking to seek spiritual truth because he's aware of the spiritual side of things and he's given to that mindset. He just thinks that the Christians are the ones that have it all wrong because of all of that, because of all of that, but that upbringing, because of all of that background. And there's no real place for him to be able to process any of this. And so he's going through and basically starting to grab a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And he gets to this philosophy called Thelmna. And it's essentially a mystical experience from Egypt stemming from the 1900s. And this is where he claims that he received a channeled text called the Book of the Law that was dictated by a being called Iowas. And the central tenet is do what thou wilt Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will. Now, on the surface, that might sound like freedom or like this endless expression of love. But Crowley meant something far deeper. Will didn't refer to whims or desires, but discovering one's true will, kind of a spiritual identity. And the practices included rituals, magical ceremonies, meditation, and a practice called sex magic. Basically, at the height of sexual intercourse, your deepest desires and your true will can be heard by the universe. It's a practice that is has been taken in by several different forms of religion and occult practices. So what we have here up to this point is a grab bag of these different practices from all of these different from all of these different regions and areas of the world and time periods, all kind of amalgamized into one central premise that he would then go and teach.
Yeah, and this is stuff that took him years to develop all this because he starts off as a younger lad joining the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which you don't know what that is. It's worthy of its own episode, kind of, because essentially at the end of the day, it's a bunch of rich British guys coming together to pal around, and every now and then we'll attempt something arcane because we have nothing better to do with our times. There were some actual people who were real believers in it, but it was really kind of a social club, kind of like the same things. Some parts of the Hellfire Club were the same. There were other parts that were a little beyond that, but it was a good old boys club for rich guys to get together, screw around, have sex with women, drink, party, and occasionally get into the arcane. And he was just like, well, you guys are just wasting your times. Why do I want to be with you? I'm a real believer. I'm into this stuff. Let me actually do something about that. So he kind of got disillusioned with them. And then he goes on that journey, like you mentioned before. And that's when he starts developing, I'm going to call it thelema. And once again, I'm not trying to be pedantic here. It's just how I've heard it pronounced before. And this idea of do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Well, it's a corruption of the golden rule in many respects. And he naturally wanted to do this because, and I say this with all sincerity, some people never grow up from being an edgy 13-year-old. And people like him, Anton LaVey, they just never grow up from that stage. And I'm not saying that they never grow up at all. But there's that stage of I can get back to the thing that hurt me. I can get back at the thing that I hate the most. And so he twists things from scripture and from other things as well that he didn't particularly like. Like he made fun of the Golden Dawn as well throughout his rituals and his lawmaking and stuff like that. But it's built off of that premise of, just do what feels right after you've studied it, after you've done all this, to figure out where you want to be. And of course, well, what young man isn't going to start a sex cult that can just give him whatever he wants and say, no, this is part of my religion. It's fine.
Yeah. But see, that's the thing. Like, at the same token, there are people that like part of the complication when talking about these actual practices and getting into the nuts and bolts of it is a fundamental misstep to throw it all out and say it's fake and say it's all hogwash and things like that, because while you can have a great many perspectives and points of view on what it is that you're engaging with, like where these things are coming from, what these things actually are, and all of those kinds of things. Um, the fact remains is there are two groups of people that are out there. There are the groups that use it as like a social club. There have been many flavors of that in human history, where rich people get together and they have rituals and they have they basically use it as a backbone for what is essentially a cult of like sometimes a cult of personality centered around a single person, or a cult centered around wealth and a central premise. And people that would also go into that category are the people that just kind of screw around with this and say that they are um that they are into this, but like in a 13-year-old shopping at Hot Topic kind of way. And then there are the people who have seen this and
Yes.
have seen what happens and have seen things that you cannot rationally put lyrics to and really formulate like an explanation around within the natural world. And so when you start taking all of these different practices and throwing them all together, there is room in the conversation that if you knock hard enough at the door, eventually something opens that door. Now, the problem with that, and even just saying that, is man, you have everything from 70s and 80s rock and roll to the Satanic Panic to um 2000s really bad TV shows that are all kind of lending to a perceived mystic legacy for this guy, like he was more than what he was. And he is benefited by hanging out in a part of town where you have a number of different practices all together and still practiced today by folks that are generally spiritually open or spiritually lost. And so they embrace the fact that it's kind of a I believe everything sort of thing, or they believe one of the very specific offshoots that were only born like some of the oldest ones. I mean, we're just starting to talk about 100 years old. Like we're just hitting that point with some of the
Yes.
oldest, let alone like the younger versions of these things, that because they are adaptations of different practices, get to kind of ride the coattails of older practices as if they are older or more archaic than they actually are.
Yeah. You raise a good point there, and I agree. And it's like I do think this man experienced some supernatural things in the process of his asking for revelation and his asking for things to be delivered to him. And I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, not typical Christian. If Iwas was a demon, consorting with him and like tricking him into believing these things, and that's how it came about, or some other entity that was able to do that as a way of gaining power for itself, or just to screw with mankind, or something like that, because that's what it's wont to do. And as well, like, yeah, this is also building off of some earlier things that we have in theosophy, which, oh gosh, if we did an episode of that, I'd lose all my hair. But we are, like you said, there's other things that are influenced by his teachings of the Lema, and that, of course, being The most obvious one I can think of is Wicca, um, because he had some interactions with what was the founder's name? I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, Wicca's not as old as you think it is, and it's
Nope.
about to be like what 90-ish years old. Well, it's 90
Something
years
like
old
that. Yeah.
now. It'll be about 100 years in like 2033 or thereabouts,
Yeah.
and it's still lasting today. If people even don't even know where what their belief come from, because it is trickled down into these cults. It's trickled down into magically influenced kind of people, and that they believe this, but they have no idea where it came from because that's just what they've been taught, and the guy from before them didn't know where it came from. So it's to them kind of lost to the sands of time, but it's still reverberated to the point where he's an initiator of a lot of this.
Yeah. And his name was the name that you're trying to think of is Gerald Gardner.
Thank you.
Yeah. He is so and the reality is, and I know from being in that world, becomes it becomes a no-win situation because so much of the premise is about stripping away what the man has to say about, religious control or communing with nature and engaging with the nature spirits and things like that, or a straight up rejection and rebellion against standard religious practice, i.e., the Christian church. And whenever I talk to somebody about all of this, I try to reinforce this idea that it's not that God said stay away from this stuff because it's all fake. And the misstep is pretending like it's all fake and pretending like
Yes.
there's no truth to be had in any of it. The problem, though, is when you try to separate fact from fiction and truth from myth, very quickly you're going to be shut down as just another dogmatic person that is trying to push a very specific agenda. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Because I am of the belief multiple times in scripture we see people who have actual magical talent, and that's something. There's a reason why it's in the law, and beyond that, after we have the moral law of never consorting with it, because God says, "I know it's real. It's a part of your fallen world. Don't go to it." Now, there are other people who would say the complete opposite and say it's never a thing. It's just like don't even bother doing it because it's not real. You're wasting your time. I'm not of that belief because I look at someone like Balaam, blessing Israel, uh, directed by God to do so, even though he didn't want to. He was a prophet. He was able to divine things. You go the Witch of Endor, depending on how you interpret that story, she was either a necromancer or a fake or a charlatan in that respect. Then you have Simon Magus in Acts, who seemed to have some type of power on his own. I'm sure there's other people I'm forgetting about, but I think it is real. It's something that needs to be taken more seriously, and I think this is part of a failing not only of the church but a post Enlightenment world where we kind of
Yes.
lose things as folly, as unscientific, as illogical. And yeah, from a scientific standpoint, they are illogical because you can't replicate these things in a lab or in nature in the same respects. So I get why you would say that, but I think that's also a discredit to actual supernatural events in the world because by their very nature, they are up super above nature.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's I think part of that is I think part of that kind of mindset is where very little in the way of nuanced conversation can take place because it is all just fake or oh we just don't even talk about it or anything like that. And there's really is a lot that can be learned, and coming from the religious side, a lot of this there I will say there are people who engage with this stuff that are, like I said, religiously open or religiously curious. And there are a lot of people that are just out there trying to figure out what is on the other side of the veil, so to speak. And the ideas that it teaches are alluring because they offer a measure of control by way of gaining a deeper understanding of what is happening in the world, or these different concepts or different things like that, or control through being able to master the spiritual or master the supernatural for your own benefit. And part of that kind of comes around back to the cult of personality sort of conversation that you have to have with somebody like Crowley, because he was more than just a spiritual teacher. He was a provocateur. He deliberately played on public perception. He understood that scandal and controversy were his best friends. He experimented with drugs. He had openly um he had he had openly he had open relationships with multiple people and conducted occult rituals that were shocking to the Victorian society. And that's what got him dubbed the wickedest man in the world. And he wore that like a badge of honor. He knew exactly what he was doing. And so much of what we quote unquote know about Aleister Crowley is wrapped up in myth. It's wrapped up in exaggeration. And some of it he even self created. He loved crafting a mystique around himself. And he leaned into the theatrics that are naturally present when you're talking about things that are overtly spiritual in nature. And that's some of the same stuff that we see in some flavors of Christianity, where there's very little in the way of evidence for it. And so people can kind of take it and run with it. And where this conversation gets uncomfortable is, you know, guys like Christian and I, we don't always see eye to eye theologically. We don't always see eye to eye sociologically. But we are two of the guys that we know in an unfortunately dwindling list that when it comes to theology prime and the basics of foundational theology, we're at least playing in the same ballpark. You know what I mean? Even if we're not exactly on the
Yeah.
same page, we're in the same book. And when you start to go outside of that and you start to look at some of the expansions on Christianity, this is why it's important. Like, I'm not gonna make any friends by saying this, and it is what it is. But this is why it's important to be aware of some of these spiritual practices, because it's one thing to call yourself something or to say a certain thing, meaning all of the best intentions in the world, right? Like sometimes we throw this stuff around and it's not like there's malicious intent thrown out by these different things. But if you don't understand where that's actually coming from, there's a certain point where you have to consider how much you're actually able to separate art from artist. And I don't mean that with Crowley, because Crowley's just another guy that did this. Crowley is just another guy. Sorry to anybody who thinks he's more than that, but Crowley is just another guy in a long list of people who did exactly what he did. He just did it with more theatrics. He had a flair for the
Flair.
dramatic. Yeah. And being unaware of the actual spiritual implications of this, and the fact that just because Crowley wasn't a good dude and not somebody who should be emulated doesn't mean that he never engaged with the supernatural, or like all of this stuff that he grab bagged and all of this kind of stuff is every single bit of it fake because it's not white Western Christianity. Just because that is true doesn't mean that we should ignore it or pretend like it doesn't exist. But not knowing where that comes from is a gigantic danger. It is. I cannot spell it out any plainer than that. And I've been on both sides of the fence here, y'all. This is coming from somebody who was a part of these kinds of rituals, summoning God knows what from God knows where. We could sit here and say it was an earth spirit. We could sit here and say it was an ancestor. We could sit here and say it's any number of things. But this is what happens when you hear my stories and you hear me reference. Why do I not do any of this anymore? Why do I not do investigations anymore? Because y'all, I was caught with my pants around my ankles, messing around with what goes bump in the night, and I found out. You know what I mean? And so it's
Yes.
But again, where this gets uncomfortable is where we start to get into all of the influences, because the influences don't just live and die with Wicca. We can't just point to anti-Christian sentiment, because we can point, because we have to be willing to, if we are looking at the full gambit, the fact that there are plenty concepts in certain flavors and flares, especially in a modern version where truth is nigh non-existent anymore and open to your own interpretation because it makes you feel good, that now suddenly we get all new flavors who really aren't new. There's nothing new under the sun, but it's
Yes.
it's a different flavor that, because it carries that Christian phrase, because it's something Christian, it's cool because it's got God in it.
I absolutely agree with you. I'm sick and tired of people adding on to scripture, of adding on to Christianity, of saying I am Christian this, I am that has nothing to do with the Bible, it has nothing to do with God. At the same time, when we're dealing with someone like this, I can just say and be truthful that he's a wackadoo, because he is. But then if I just leave it there, I've failed, because this is someone who was directly hurt by a poor attempt at Christianity. And who were
Yep.
the people in his life that tried to talk to him about this? Maybe there was someone who was doing their job planting seeds. I don't know. He doesn't really
Maybe.
focus on them. But maybe there wasn't. I kind of tend towards there wasn't one, because if we just look at every critic that he ever had, every review of stuff that he ever had that came especially from a Christian lens, is this guy's an idiot. He has nothing of spiritual truth in him, which, by the way, is true. But then you don't actually engage with the man who is behind this. You don't engage with the person behind this. And yeah, not everyone who called themselves a pagan today has his exact ideology and beliefs. But if I just look at them and say they believe this, they're never going to believe in truth anyways. So I'm just going to just screw you, focus on my people here, and grow insular. And not engage with the world around me, then I have failed them too. And I can't accept that
Yeah.
because I'm called to be better than that. I'm called to go out into the world, not be of the world, but be in the world, to be with these people who need Jesus. I don't go to people who are healthy, I go to people who are sick, and they need to realize that they're sick. And I need to do that in a way that doesn't destroy them, that doesn't make them weak, that makes them actually realize, oh, you have worth beyond what you think you do. And unfortunately, I don't see that in Crowley's life. Uh, I don't see that in Blavatsky's life or Hunter's life, or even later on, we'd have Jack Parsons, and who's behind a lot of our rocket industry, by the way, and was very into Thelema and also worthy of his own episode in many respects. Another wackadoo, but someone who could have used someone to actually care about him. To get, hey,
Yeah.
why do you believe the way that you do? What is it? What happened? Who hurt you? And not just like a generic kind of sense, like how can I help you in the midst of your hurt that was caused by more than likely a Christian in the circumstance? So I can let you know that, hey, what they did was wrong. This is how it's actually supposed to be. And I'm not going to say that what you're doing is good, because then that defeats the purpose of me talking to you. But I am going to let you know that you're valued, that there's something in there that needs to change because of what you're doing right now. And it's not good for you or the people you're influencing. And I just simply
Yeah.
don't see that in his life.
I don't I there it's at least not part of what was pulled forward in the annals of the mythology of Crowley. If it was, it wasn't picked up on and survived the test of time and all of that sort of stuff. And just understanding the time period and the people that he separate or that he centered himself around, he kind of even in the last leg of his life where like it seemed like he calmed down and all of that and he seemed like he settled down and all of that, even that was weird. Even that was a weird situation. It was somebody who thought very highly of him for one reason or another, you know what I mean? um
Yeah.
and it is unfortunate because when you look at the realities of this kind of situation, this could be anybody. This could be anybody that just gets the wrong stuff poured into them and then is treated like they are subhuman for it. Like one of the things that blows people's minds when I tell them is that I have and would very willingly go to and am regularly invited to have a presence at um what are essentially tantamount to religious conventions that are like gatherings of a whole lot of different religious practitioners, many of which being different flavors of Wicca and different like pagan beliefs and different things, like just a lot of different flavors of spiritualism and stuff like that. Namely, because I have gone out of my way to make a name for myself, to not treat people like a project because I don't agree with what they believe in. There are plenty of people with within the world of Christendom that I don't agree with, let alone people outside of it. But I guess I was benefited from never going through a phase of thinking that as Christians we are called to separate ourselves from the world. I never went through that. So it's never been a thought in my head. As a matter of fact, knowing how wrong that is in seeing that in practice, it was even less tempting or alluring to me. Because you can pretend like something doesn't exist. You can pretend like things that we cannot explain don't exist. That doesn't stop them from not existing. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that the thing that goes bump in the night isn't there just because you stick your head underneath your covers and pretend like it doesn't exist. And likewise, when you're in a circle and you've got the whole ritual and you've got the whole thing and the whole shebang, and something that wasn't there before. Now, we've talked about, previous conversations about mass hallucinations and the fact that it's scientifically flawed to think that everybody had a shared hallucinogenic experience and all of that kind of stuff. Even if everybody was on hallucinogenics, you couldn't like actually line up a mass sensory hallucination like that. It is a scientific impossibility. But when you have multiple people who have experienced the exact same thing, I mean, there's only so much that you can start to poke holes in it and say, oh, it's just the power of suggestion. Oh, it's just the power of this. Oh, it's just the power of that. Before you have to actually get to the fact that, no, we messed around and found out. Like, that's the deal. That's what happened. And we have to be willing to accept, A, that there are things that go bump in the night. B, that some of those things have grown to the acclaim that they have because of culture, society, and the Christian church. Because we had this little thing that swept across the world called the Satanic Panic, where we thought that boogeyman was around every single corner and underneath every single pillow and in every single school and in every single game of Dungeons and Dragons and in every single Pokemon and in every single thing that we deemed is of the devil. And that became the central focus. But the thing is, that whole generation of people who have been hurt by all of those things, they spawned off people that raised people that were hurt by those things. And say it with me, everybody, hurt people hurt people. That's just the reality of it. And so we then have things like New Age practitioners and different syncretism of different religious practices with each other. And it might not seem like a big deal to just say, oh, hey, I'm going to take this philosophy. It's got other things attached to it. I'm just gonna lop that off. We don't need that. We don't need that. Let's just leave that behind. Let's just leave that over there. I just mean the stuff that doesn't contradict. I just mean what in the world, y'all? Like, okay, the old adage goes is that if you want anything that's consistent, you've got to cherry pick. And being somebody who studies the mystics, I do not say that every mystical writer is all made the same way. Not all flavors are the same of Christian mysticism. I will be the first one to tell you. I tend around medieval mysticism-ish. Like, there are some outside of that ballpark, but that's generally the part of town that I hang out in when reading the mystics and all of that sort of stuff. But it's all got, like, the ones that I think are onto something are all sit under the same idea and the same theme. So yes, I too look at situations and cherry pick. But at what point are we fooling ourselves? And that's what I think. That's what I think. So you want to talk about religious weirdness? And I said this at the beginning. I said this 50 minutes ago. You all asked for this episode. You guys are the ones that voted for this. No, all jokes aside, I do want it to be heard. I do want it to be heard. I understand this is a democracy and we do it for a reason. We want to make content that you all want to hear and all of that sort of stuff. So I keep making that joke, but it really is a joke. And we appreciate every single one of you that turn out every single month, that chime in every single time that we do a poll like that and you guys cast your vote and all of that. Seriously, this show exists because of the engagement that you all give on a frequent basis. So please do not hear that and think that I am anything less than appreciative of every single one of you that engage. But where I think some of this needs to sit, and we need to be willing to be uncomfortable about it, and then I'll turn it back over to you because I've been preaching for 20 minutes. Is,
Nothing out of the
it,
ordinary.
it, is yeah, yeah, yeah. Is sitting at the level of, okay, so you've got this guy, cult of personality, you've got this guy deeply hurt, and then went and created a name for himself and amassed a following and created a commune of people and did all of these religious rituals and all of this kind of stuff. And half of it is probably absolute hogwash, but there's also half of it that we need to be aware of as people who like, I don't know, worship a guy who came back from the dead. Seriously, I don't understand. But we embrace the supernatural on a daily basis, right? Whether we like to say it like that or not, whether or not that makes us comfortable or not. If you are a Christian, you embrace the supernatural on a daily basis. And so you have this in this guy, in this figure, this Aleister Crowley, right? The wickedest man on earth, because he was an absolute immoral person who thought that the best good is serving your own ridiculous pleasures. And one of the best moments that I had was having a checkmate moment with my nephew the one day where, like, I was 18 once. I was an 18-year-old man. I thought I had the world by the short hairs. I thought I had the world all figured out when I was 18. And we're having this deep conversation and he's thinking he's got me wrapped around his finger as far as like people just going after their own good and all of this kind of stuff. And I was like, yeah, okay, I hear you. I understand. There have been many people who have thought like that, namely a guy named Aleister Crowley. Go ahead and look him up. You know what I mean? That was his entire thesis statement. And so we have all of this. But where this conversation needs to also sit is the ripple effects and the cautionary tale of how willing we are to pull forward this piece of nonsense and that piece of nonsense, or this philosophy or that philosophy, or this practice and that practice, all because it soothes the wounds that this world has to offer. And please, oh please, oh please, oh please, we are talking about a man, or we this is coming from a man that, like, when I say I get it, by I get it, I mean I will meet my son one day in heaven. I get it. This world is hard. This world is tragic. I get all that. And I'm not devaluing any of that. So please do not think I am sitting on an uninformed hill casting stones at anybody. But we have to be willing to ask the question, what is driving us to be pulling in all of these different things and still be brass and bold enough to actually think that we are still talking about Christianity?
First off, I'll say the part Joe didn't say about the voting. The 6 months of you guys voting is also why we get 6 months to ourselves to pick what we actually want to do, even though I'm the one who puts the things up for people to be voting on.
Yep. Christian just said the quiet part out loud, but yes, that's why we take 6 months off from allowing others to pick what we're going to talk about.
But we do really love your engagement. I just say that tongue in cheek just to mess with you, and I knew that'd get a laugh out of Joe. Second, in regards to Crowley himself, I'll flip flop between the two. Very prickly man at times. He was not an easy man to get along with if you weren't like right beside him saying you were a yes man, and not even a yes man. That's unfair to him. If you weren't like serious, I'll say, about following after what he said, and men like that are very difficult to deal with, are very difficult to talk with. Women too, same thing. But you know who else is difficult to deal with? People who are so dogmatic that for their own good, they can't even realize that they're harming the person they're speaking to because they're not willing to listen to the other person, even if they say something that's true. And I've met too many of those people, especially in the church. It's not just a Christian phenomenon. Everyone has it in some way, shape, or
No.
form, but it's worse when it's Christians because of us supposedly, and I would say, yes, we do hold the truth. And when we are misrepresenting the truth, that brings harm into the world. When we do not sit there and listen, if someone came up to me and they were espousing these same beliefs, and I just said, well, that's stupid. You should actually believe in this. I just called them an idiot to their face. And by the way, that's also me acting in anger, which, by the way, Jesus calls out and says is bad. So I need to actually reach that person. I can think what they're saying is stupid, and probably I'm going to be true. It's going to be true, but that doesn't help me interact with them. That doesn't help me understand where they're coming from. So if you're thinking about this regard, if someone comes with a new age, pagan, Wicca, whatever belief, even theosophy, I guess God loves them too. Like you need to come to them, listen to what they have to say, but also speak truth without being a jerk about it. Without there are words I could use here to go beyond that. But because people did exactly that, we ended up in a scenario that we're in right now, where we have offshoots of this in places that don't even realize they're offshoots of it because it was so successful, because it found so many people willing to believe in it because of its central message. Do what thou wilt according to the law. And I'm doing what I will. I haven't met the person who doesn't. And so no wonder it's so attractive. No wonder he gained as many people as he did. No wonder he inspired so many people ages beyond after he died. Because that's a central part of the human nature is my will being done, my reality being true, my perception being true. And it's that seduction there that happens that, well, very little work needs to be done to bring someone on that path that we need to fight against, but in a good way to understand, well, oh, because people are people, humans are humans. No wonder this is attractive. No wonder they want to embrace something like this. No wonder a man like Crowley went from where he was, ultra conservative background, to this. I don't even, would you call this liberal in that extent? I guess so. Theology in many
Yes.
respects. Uh, because it's a rejection of that truth that even everyone knows to an extent there's a way we should be acting. Now, they're not going to understand everything without the proper instruction, I would argue, for the most part. Everyone has this in them. And I have to fight this every day in myself to not be the person to say, my will be done. You know, and so we need to understand. We need to reach out and love well. And I'll stop now because now I'm the one preaching.
Yeah, it's to say that this sort of thing um raises red flags. It is that is beyond just an understatement. Like the reality of a guy like Crowley is he sits at the level of being a cautionary figure. He is a cautionary tale. His life invites us to consider the nature of spiritual truth, the nature of authority, the human desire for transcendence, but all of that within the realm of authenticity and a desire to actually find what is true, because we can wrap all of that up and want and strive for something that makes us feel better for whatever reason, for one reason or another. And that's just the truth of it. Like, yeah, sure, there is a reality to some of these, you know, these spiritual things, you know, the fact that there are things that can and are drawn forward by some of these practices, it's all sitting alongside the appeal of radical autonomy, spiritual power, and a rejection of moral constraint. It's a rejection of, and why this is so this remains so alluring is it allows us to reject the parts that we don't want of any given practice. It allows us to reject the parts that make us feel uncomfortable. It allows us to reject the parts that we don't like because somebody taught us poorly or somebody used them as a weapon or whatever the case may be. And his story reminds us that not all spiritual paths lead to life, and that the pursuit of personal power can, in fact, lead us far away from peace. This is a guy who ended up a heroin addict. This is a guy who ended up very sick and nigh alone, and it was only because one of his followers took him in and helped him get clean so that way he would marry her and have her and she could have his babies. That's essentially it. And that's really like the ending of his story is one of his fanatic followers took him in and he kind of toned it down at the very end. But we have to take the sum total of what a life like this showcases and what we are really trying to draw out of something like this. Because behind all of the mysticism, behind all of the occult stuff, beyond all of the different practices, and beyond all of the different religious debates and all of this kind of stuff sits a man that engaged with a particular religious practice, a man that rejected one way of life and embraced another way of life. And the reality is, you have to look and honestly say, does that actually bring like real eternal peace? Or is it just something that makes you feel good? Yeah, there is religious weirdness to this because evil stuff does exist. Dark stuff does exist. Spiritual entities outside of God and angels exist. I would argue that spiritual entities outside of God, angels, and demons exist. And yeah, there's that. And that stuff, it's not hard to make any of that alluring because we get to have whatever flavor of it we want. But if you're concocting your own flavor, if you're putting your own sundae together and all of that, then I just challenge you to be brave enough to ask the question, why? Why do you feel the need to take an edit? Why do you feel the need? Now, don't blind dogmatism is a different conversation. Blindly following something else because that's the popular school of thought, or that's a standard school of thought, or anything else like that. Like I said, there are plenty of things and aspects of the religious and sociological landscape of the modern day that many will look at me and say I'm way more, liberal or progressive or whatever the case may be. That's not necessarily the issue here. Like we're not saying don't to just blindly accept all of those things, but let's not be reactionary either. And I think that's exactly what we see out of a guy like Crowley. And I think that's exactly why that aspect and like so if I'll let my Christian brothers and sisters off the hook for a second, and I'll stop harping on you all. You know who else was largely inspired by Aleister Crowley, openly so? The founder of Scientology. Scientology has its roots in Crowley's teachings. And like you said, Parsons and all of his stuff was very devoutly a follower of Crowley's teachings. Wicca has its roots in this part of town too. So before you cast off guys like Christian and I as being overly religiously staunch or conservative or dogmatic, when you get into the conversation of picking and choosing, when you get into the conversation of this doesn't align with my philosophy, take a look to your left and take a look to your right and ask yourself who you're standing shoulder to shoulder with. I'm not saying everybody's bad. Hear me. Because again, I am the guy that openly goes to these things because I have a conversation with people and I don't need to preach at them. They know I'm not going to preach at them. They know I'm not going to be there to be like, I need to be here to convert all of the godless heathens that are here right now. That's not my point. But I am also very openly going to say this stuff doesn't lead to life. And just like for people that are trying to add on to, it doesn't lead to life. That's not what what this leads to. And I'm not willing, even though I've experienced the dark side of spirituality and the thing that goes bump in the night, I'm not willing to leave this on some kind of, ooh, could it all be real and this and that and fake mystery for a guy like this, for a subject like this. I'm just not willing to. Not at this point in my life being a pastor, not at this point in my life being the person that I am. No, we need to treat this as it is, a cautionary tale.
There's a reason I put him on the list. I was, just making fun earlier, but he is a very fascinating figure. And if you actually take the time to read what he said, read what he actually believed, and he added it over time because that was part of his process, was figuring things out. You know, he added more to the mythos as time went on. Just see where he was at those times. His history is fascinating. This man also, we didn't really go into like his spy work potentially as part of being in America during World War One, and pretending to be a sympathizer to the Kaiser to kind of make it sound ridiculous and maybe get Americans on the British side in World War One. He was a patriot in many respects in that regard. Like this man is multifaceted. You can just say cult leader and just end him, or just religious wacko and end the day. But you need to actually study him. You need to actually figure out where did he come from, why did he believe what he believed, how did he end up bringing that into the world, and what was his final end, and is that something that you want to emulate? Is that something that brings pleasure to you? Is It doesn't bring pleasure to me to see how he ends, but what it does is help me understand people in his situation a lot better, and to look at other people who then believe in things that he says better. Not perfectly, because I still need to actually get to know them, but it can be a jumping point, a starting point.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really what it comes down to, right? Like when you're looking at stuff like this, you got to be willing to look honestly at everything that's going on and be informed and not just pretend like this stuff doesn't exist. Stick your head under in the sand and ignore anybody who doesn't think like you or practice the same thing you do, or treat them like they are a project, because they are not a project. They are a human being. They are a real person with real thoughts and real opinions that also is an image bearer and loved and cherished by God. It's that's it. And so we need to be willing to have honest and open dialogue without just jumping straight to you're wrong, you're a heretic, and you must be converted to the other way of thinking, you know? And those are the things that I think that can be drawn from a guy like Aleister Crowley and a story like Crowley's. And it's a background that is weird and multifaceted and all of those kinds of things. But it is one that is plagued by an increasing desire to always be going after more, or always remain in this posture of being a slave to your own desires and your own wants, and always being largely unsatisfied because you've put your stock in things that are ultimately born of yourself.
Yeah.
So a little bit different of one this time, a little bit different of an episode. As we bring this thing in for a landing, Christian, why don't you let the folks know what's next up on the schedule that they can be expecting?
All right. Last time I checked, it was pretty resounding. I believe over 51%. For our next topic, we're going to be doing the weird and the unexplained. And what I mean by that is just kind of and the rest. We have all these other topics and settings. This is kind of, they may fit in other categories, but I'm just going to lump them all together because it's not really a concrete one. And you guys chose, did King Arthur exist?
I love holding off on looking at those because I'm usually, surprised when we do these things that Christian lets me know for the first time what we're going to be doing as the subject. So that will be a good one, y'all. Thank you for showing up for this evening's conversation about the religiously weird and the spooky. We will be back next month with our next installment. Like I said, if you want to have a say in what we choose, go ahead and jump on over to Facebook and join the Priest to the Geeks page and or group, and you'll be able to cast your vote there. While you are at it, make sure that you subscribe wherever you are tuning in from for today's episode, so that way you do not miss any future uploads and any of the channels within the network. But until next time, thank you all. Stay spooky. Peace.